A gaming monitor that has aesthetics in mind. Today we're looking at the Porsche design AOC Agon Pro PD34, which sports a curved 34-inch glossy QD-OLED panel that operates a refresh rate of 240Hz and a resolution of 1440p. Better still, it has got adaptive sync technologies, G-Sync compatibility, a stunning HDR reproduction, USB Type-C with a built-in KVM switch, making it useful for productivity, and of course those fabled HDMI 2.1 ports. Now at the time of filming and in the UK it can be found for roughly £1,000. And in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so you can make your own informed purchasing decision. So let's jump straight in and talk about its input lag. And yes, this is going to be very important to those hardcore and casual gamers. Now, for someone who's tested over 260 different PC monitors, I can safely say that this monitor's input lag is phenomenal, and you'll have no problems whatsoever even when you are faced with a hardcore competitive shooter such as Counter-Strike 2 or Valorant. I'm not really sure why you'd play these games on a 34-inch curved ultrawide, but nonetheless, in terms of my own experiences, I can say my mouse inputs were being registered instantaneously. It's worth noting over here that my comments were said with the low input lag mode enabled by the monitor's OSD. If you were to enable adaptive sync technology such as AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, the low input lag mode does become grayed out but seemingly stays on. Again, from my own subjective opinion, it didn't seem to overly impact my overall user experience. However, it is worth considering that if you were to drop the refresh rate down to 60Hz for any given reason, the low input lag mode becomes grayed out and then disabled. And here you will be able to notice an increase in input lag. So just some food for thought. Now, aside from its stockingly good input lag, we should also talk about its response time. And given it's a QD-OLED panel, it's no surprise to learn that it actually does a tremendous job in this department as well. Using the OSRTT tool to measure the objective number, you'll be able to see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen the average initial time, which translates to average G2G, which most manufacturers claim. And here it clocked in at just 0.85 milliseconds. This was tested at 240Hz and it hits 100% of that refresh rate window. Indeed, it does do a phenomenal job. This is certainly going to be one-upping some of its LCD counterparts, in other words, IPS, VA or TNs. Now, in terms of the overall motion clarity, you'll be able to see over here via the UFO ghosting test that at 240Hz is better in comparison to the lower refresh rates. It's no surprise over here because you've just got higher frames to play around with. And this is something of a selling point for this monitor because you will be able to compare and contrast this with some cheaper alternatives that run at roughly 175Hz. And yes, that extra bit of fluidity will be felt and also will give you that extra bit of motion clarity. Also, just to further emphasize over here, you've got no inverse ghosting or overshoot like you'd find on LCD panels with their overdrive modes because we are running a QD-OLED panel. Moving swiftly on, let's talk about adaptive sync technologies. And here the monitor has got AMD FreeSync Premium Pro certification and NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility. It has got a VRR range from 48 up to 240Hz. Now, with my system, which has an RTX 3080 and while connected over DisplayPort, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo. I didn't encounter any sort of black screen issues. Now, there is a little bit of flickering that might be noticeable via the camera. However, in person, it is not noticeable whatsoever. However, I just thought to point this out just in case you've got overly sensitive eyes. And also, it is worth highlighting over here that all the OLEDs that I've currently tested pretty much have VRR flicker. Yet again, it's not something to be overly concerned about, but yet again, something I thought I should just highlight in this video. Now, when it comes to using this monitor and playing more casual games, such as, let's say, Destiny 2, I should talk about HDR. And here, the HDR reproduction is absolutely sublime. This is thanks to the fact that you have got a DisplayHDR True Black 400 mode, which really does give you a lifelike reproduction. This will cap the overall brightness at roughly 400 nits and therefore might seem a little bit more dim in comparison to running the HDR Peak or any of the HDR modes such as movie or game, but here I just felt it gave me the best sort of color reproduction. If, however, you really want to benefit from nearly 900 to 1000 nits of peak brightness, then you can go for one of the other HDR modes. This will really bring out all the sort of sunshine and rays from your game and allow you to really enjoy that HDR image. Simply said, if HDR is something of importance to you, you will certainly not be left disappointed by this QD-OLED panel. Now next up, I would just like to have a quick word for console gamers. And here you will be pleased to know that you've got two full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, which not only allows you to run 1440p at up to 120Hz, but also gives you VRR capabilities, such as via AMD FreeSync, which will be present on modern game consoles. Now it is also worth highlighting over here that the ultra-wide format is not supported natively via games consoles, but thankfully over here the manufacturer has thought about it, and as such you have got a 240Hz or 60Hz toggle via the OSD, and this is for the HDMI ports. Now while you do this, you will be able to notice that there is an option to run 2560x1440p. Now yes, this will give you a stretched out design and won't give you its native resolution, but will still be handy for games console users out there. Furthermore, the monitor does also accept a 4K signal input, making it handy for certain devices such as if you have got a 4K Blu-ray player. In terms of the overall performance for console gamers, you will be pleased to know that it's very impressive. Using the OSRTD tool and looking at the average initial time at 120Hz, it clocked in at just 1.08 milliseconds, while at 60Hz it sat at 1.09 milliseconds. So yes, indeed, you're going to get a phenomenal experience, and same could be said about the overall visual experience, as you've not got any sort of inverse ghosting at these lower refresh rates. But it's worth bearing in mind over here that the overall motion clarity isn't exactly as good as its higher refresh rate of 240Hz. And you have not got the ability of running any sort of motion blur reduction technologies like you'd find on some LCD alternatives. Now with the gaming performance out of the way, let's talk about its overall image quality. And as a reminder, you've got a 34-inch curved 1440p 240Hz ultra-wide monitor. Now here, the panel has got a glossy finish to it, and there's also a red tint. The red tint doesn't bother me in the slightest, specifically if you're looking at it head on. And as for the glossy finish, well, this will really depend in terms of your own room's design, because if you've got a window beside you, or for example, you have got a very bright sunlit room, then you might be able to notice some reflection. So just worth considering that if you're going to be looking at putting this in your setup. Now apart from that, there is also 1800R curvature, which adds to the extra degree of immersion given its ultra-wide format, which will be appreciated by certain gamers. Now as for the overall color accuracy, it's absolutely fantastic to see that via the monitor's OSD you have got a color temperature mode and also user preset. And as for the color gamut, you have got panel native, NTSC, sRGB, display P3, DCIe P3, and DCIe P3 D60, Adobe RGB, Adobe RGB D60, Rec 2020, and Rec 709. Yes indeed, there are plenty of options for you to play around with. Now concentrating on the sRGB mode, I was able to run this via my calibrators and measured a gamut coverage of 97% and a gamut volume of 102.9%. In terms of the overall color accuracy, it's actually very good, with an average delta of 1.04 and a maximum of 2.26. Closer to 0 is perfection. And yes, this monitor can be used for serious image editing work or video grading. As for its tested contrast ratio, it sits at infinity to 1, given it's an OLED panel, and its measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target sits at 6148 Kelvin at 100%. And in terms of its gamma curve, it sits relatively close to the 2.2 standards. Now I would also like to highlight that these modes, such as the sRGB mode that I just selected, also has full brightness controls, which is very much appreciated. Now, if you're not going to be editing in said space, and for example, you're not an image editor or video grader, then you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. Of course, you can select one of the modes that I've just mentioned, but if you're just a gamer, then I'd highly suggest running the panel native mode because it will give you a little bit of extra pop from your image. So aside from color performance, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here in HDR, in the HDR mode or the peak mode, I recorded up to 932 nits. So yes, it does get blindingly bright. If you go on the HDR True Black mode, however, it will limit it to 404 nits, which is what's required for the DisplayHDR certification. Now as for its SDR brightness, it gets up to 238 nits, and as for its minimum brightness, it goes all the way down to 16 nits. Now, in other words, this means that the monitor will be relatively bright even in an SDR image, and this will mean that you'll have to run the monitor at roughly 80 to 90% brightness most of the time, at least in a bright sunlit room. And if you're going to be running it in a completely pitch black environment, then you'll be pleased to know that this monitor has got a good sort of range, and as such means can be used in said scenario. Now, as for the overall brightness uniformity, my panel, which is of course a bit of lottery, actually did perform very well across the board. And as for the overall backlight bleed, well, it's non-existent given it's an OLED panel and therefore can switch off all of its pixels, therefore giving you a completely pitch black image. Now, so far everything is looking really positive for this monitor, but there are certain considerations you should have before jumping out and buying it. And this is of course when it comes to the fact that it's using an OLED panel. Now, first off, we have to talk about the burn-in effect, which is something that plagues any sort of OLED, be it from televisions to monitors, and indeed is something that you might want to look at. Now, thankfully over here, the manufacturers provided you a 3-year OLED warranty, and there's also ways of mitigating the burn-in effect by enabling certain settings via the OSD. Here you have got pixel orbiting, screensaver, logo protection, boundary dimmer, taskbar dimmer, and thermal protection. Furthermore, you can enable an auto warning and you'll be able to run pixel refreshes every so often in order to make sure that the image is not being retained. In other words, you're not going to get that sticky burn-in effect. Now, another thing to consider is the fringing effect, which is something that plagues every single OLED monitor just due to the fact they operate a different sub-pixel layout in comparison to a regular LCD panel. Now here, this 1440p QD-OLED panel actually still does a tremendous job and means that as someone like myself who actually does read a lot of text, it didn't really affect me. But I'll let the results talk for themselves because here you'll be able to see some differences between this monitor and some other OLEDs, including my own LCD panel. Moving swiftly on, I would like to talk about its overall build quality, and here you've got a 3-side borderless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel which has got the Porsche design logo slapped at the front, and a small little white LED which can't be disabled at the bottom right hand side. It's not overly bright, so I wouldn't worry about it. Now, the monitor has got that 1800R curvature for extra bit of immersion and has got that glossy QD-OLED panel which I did mention before. Now, as for the monitor stand, it's very sturdy and provides you height, tilt and swivel adjustments. But given its overall ultra-wide format, it's no surprise that it cannot be pivoted. In other words, you can't rotate it. If it's something that you do require, or indeed if you want to place it on a multi-arm or a multi-monitor setup, then you can replace it with a VESA-compatible stand instead. Now, given this monitor is a collaboration between AOC and Porsche Design, I should have a quick word about its overall aesthetics. And here, the sandblasted aluminium cast stand, which has got a silver finish to it, is reminiscent to the steering wheel and the wheel spokes of a Porsche 911, at least according to the manufacturer. While at the back, it has got an inspiration of the radiator grills. This has got a glossy finish to it. Now, at the rear of the monitor, you will also notice that these are RGB lights, or Light FX from AOC, and yes, they can be disabled or indeed customized via the monitor's OSD. The monitor's OSD itself can be accessed via a small little joystick button that's found at the center and underneath the monitor. The monitor's hardware-based OSD is very comprehensively laid out and just takes a little bit of getting used to because you have to press the center button to go forwards or backwards and then left or right to adjust certain options. But once you get your head around it, it's actually become second nature. Furthermore, it's good to see that you've got an extension of this via the AOC G menu software. This gives you a degree of customization of certain settings and also allows you to check for recent firmware updates. Now, for those with a keen eye, you will have noticed that the monitor has got an audio setting, and yes indeed, this is because you have got built-in speakers. 2 times 8 watt speakers with DTS sound to be more specific. And via the monitor's OSD, you'll be able to adjust the DTS sound, or of course, if you want to disable that and customize the EQ, you can do that as well. I actually preferred using the monitor with the DTS rock or indeed the game mode, but this is all very subjective. Of course, if you want better audio fidelity, I'd always suggest a set of headphones, a DAC, or let's say a set of bookshelf speakers. Now, on that note, if you do want to plug in your headphones directly into the monitor, you can do so because you've got a 3.5mm jack. Now on that notion, I should remind you that you've got two full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports and a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, all of which will allow you to output 1440p at that ultra-wide format at up to 240Hz. You have also got that toggle of 60Hz and 240Hz for the HDMI ports, which will be handy for console gamers, as I did mention before. Now apart from that, you've also got a singular USB Type-C port, 3.2 Gen 2 to be more specific, with 65 watts of power delivery. Handy, for example, if you want to use it with a laptop and simultaneously charge your device at the same time. Now here you have also got three USB Type-A 3.2 ports as well, which can be quite handy for plugging in your peripherals. And this is very much important because this monitor also has a built-in KVM switch. For those who are not aware, it means that you can effectively plug in your mouse and keyboard directly into the monitor and switch between, for example, a desktop or a laptop input and still use the same peripherals, meaning that it saves you from unplugging and replugging them. If you want some more information of how a KVM switch operates, make sure you check out my video that can be found up on your pop-up banner or by following the links down in the description below. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview of the Porsche design AOC Agon Pro PD34. I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below and if you would pick it over some rival alternatives. Now if you have enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.